part of the reason I'm here today is because if you are in the rare disease, orphan, ultra-orphan space, these products are coming to the marketplace, very innovative science and technology, but they're also coming with a very large price tag. And consequently, our counterparts in other disciplines in healthcare want to talk to us about ways that we can engage in innovative or value-based agreements. And so Bernie and I are here to talk about that. But before we get into that, Bernie, why don't you tell everybody a little bit more about you and about your background?
Thanks. Rob was telling me he's a big Twitter guy, so follow me on Twitter. I'll follow you back. It's a great way to exchange ideas. I have been with UPMC Health Plan since 2017. Prior to that, I was with the Department of Veterans Affairs, and from 1999 through 2017, I chaired the Medical Advisory Panel for Pharmacy Benefits Management. So spent a lot of time working nationally with the drug benefit there. And it's been really exciting coming to UPMC Health Plan, where I'm a senior medical director and I direct the Center for Value-Based Pharmacy Initiatives. And I think it's just a really exciting time. I think there's a lot of hand-wringing over drug costs, but at the same time, there are some really, really great drugs out there that, you know, in the rare disease space. I was just out at a meeting last week or the week before looking at gene therapies, and it's really is amazing what some of these things offer children especially. And then, you know, in oncology, you know, we have newer drugs and we have people that are being, you know, treated, and some are even being cured, or at least have long-term responses to some of these cancers that, you know, used to kill people. I see that a couple weeks ago, President Carter, they were showing he had fallen down and cut himself, but he had also had, I think, a birthday not too long ago. Anyway, like something like I think it was 2014, he was diagnosed with metastatic melanoma with multiple mets to his brain and to his liver, and in his 90s. And before some of the immunotherapies came out, he would have been dead within 3 months. Without question. And here he is, you know, doing well enough to be walking around to fall down and, you know, cut himself, but, you know, he's back, you know, working with Habitat, and so truly miraculous. So it's a challenging time, and so one of the fun things is to try to think about ways in which we can work together with all of our stakeholders and try to figure out ways in which we can capitalize on value of some of these newer technologies. It doesn't work for all drugs in all spaces, but in a lot of these new therapies, it's given us an opportunity to think about ways in which we can engage with our industry partners to come up with contracting that is based on this value proposition. So I think I'll stop there.
So, as a manufacturer, how many people out there are representing manufacturers? So, a good number. So, if you think about bringing a product to market, and I'm very involved in pricing, have been for many, many years, many times other stakeholders don't appreciate what goes into the process of pricing a drug. It's not as simple as we want to make lots of money, so we're going to price it as high as we can. That isn't always what factors into the decision-making process, but it's part of it. And some of our friends look at us with a jaundiced eye, but there are components that go into pricing, and it's a very involved process. I bring it up because when you launch a drug, you've got a clean sheet of paper. Here is your WAC price, your wholesale acquisition cost price. Now, all of a sudden, we are hit with all of the statutory discounts that we're required to provide, 23.1 for Medicaid. I think the FSS requires manufacturers to discount and offer rebates. But these statutory obligations that we have to meet, suddenly start impacting that price. And as many of us who've been in the industry a long time recognize that in the government pricing and reporting space, this is a system that was put in place many, many years ago when we were talking about primary care, small molecule drugs. And that system hasn't evolved with technology and with the innovation that's coming to the marketplace. So we as manufacturers, when we want to start engaging in these conversations, whereas before we had the Lipitors of the world, we would come and we would offer a traditional rebate contract based on market share, and we would pay the payer based on their quarterly data submissions. We would pay them rebate. We've entered into a new world in a system that has not caught up with that new world. So as we move forward and we think about these value-based contracts, I'm going to turn it over to Bernie here and ask Bernie, considering the things that I've brought up around some of the limitations that we as manufacturers have, what are your ideas on some of the things that we could possibly do to work together?
So I was getting a little teary-eyed when you were talking about all those price issues. I take it you like 340B though, right?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, I'm just checking. What we've done with our at UPMC is our secret sauce is we've decided that we want to try to look for things that are valuable to our stakeholders. And so we actually, when we're interested in a drug category or disease state, and we have some industry partners that are also interested in engaging into some, working with us, we'll do a Delphi survey of our stakeholders. And so that includes, first and foremost, most importantly, our patients. And we always oversample our patients. And then we also oversample our clinicians, our prescribers. But then we also include our pharma partners. We include our PBM, pharmacists. And depending on the drug, we might include employers that are paying for our product. So really depending. So we have some interest in migraines, and we're sending questionnaires, these Delphi surveys to employers to find out what are the sort of outcomes that are most important to all of our stakeholders. And then we try to figure out a way to look at these drugs and look at how do these drugs address these things that are most valuable. So oftentimes our industry partners will come to us and they've got sort of a already prepared value-based contract, and more often than not, we're not that interested in it. And I think for those that were in Dr. Mesiwala's talk earlier today, she sort of mentioned that. And it's things like looking at adherence or outcomes that are secondary outcomes. We think it's important to take drugs, but when we enter into these contracts, we develop wraparound programs to make sure that our patients are taking the drugs. And certainly we want to look for outcomes that are done in patients that, pardon me, are taking the drug. But we're really interested in working collaboratively with our industry partners to find out ways in which we can agree what outcomes are important, and then try to, put some risk on the table with our industry partner and develop these contracts that look at those outcomes. So in some cases, those outcomes are things that are easily measured. So they're, if we can keep patients out of the hospital, if they don't have heart attacks, if they, whatever it is, keep them out of the emergency room, those are all good. And we love, one of the nice things about being at UPMC is we're an integrated delivery and finance system. And so that allows us to not be siloed into a pharmacy silo where we're just worried about the cost of the drug, but we can say, let's be more concerned about overall total cost of care. And so that is one metric that we've actually used in one of our contracts looking at in the diabetes space. looking at the impact of using a particular drug on total cost of care. In other situations, there aren't easy outcomes, like you can't look at ER visits. So think about all the new medications for migraines. Well, most people with migraines aren't getting admitted to the hospital because of their migraines. In fact, they aren't going to the ER that often either. What's the problem? The problem is that they either miss work or they're not productive when they're at work because they're miserable. And so depending on the drug, we have to be more creative, and we're really looking at patient-reported outcomes, work-related outcomes, we're trying to reimagine this concept of value so that it's not just, total cost of care, although we love total cost of care, but in some cases it's just not relevant. We're trying to, expand this concept and look at other things that we can measure, which can make a value proposition for our customers, for both our patients who are worried about how much they have to pay, as well as for those people that are buying, those industries that are buying our healthcare product.
So I heard you say a couple of things that really resonated with me, and I think those of us who come from the manufacturer side recognize that sometimes there's a lot of difficulty, and that those making the decisions want us to roll out one-size-fits-all, if you will, boilerplate contracts. And UPMC, at least, is not necessarily close to the idea, but you'd rather have conversations around total cost of care. Is that a fair?
Or other sorts of outcomes that are important to our stakeholders.
Okay. And then the other thing that I've dealt with in the past, and I'm sure that some of you have, and by the way, if you all have questions, feel free to walk up to one of the microphones and we'll certainly address those things. But one of the things that I've dealt with in the past, and I would offer to some of you to share some ideas as well, is actually segmenting accounts and defining accounts in different ways. It's very difficult in today's environment, at least in my experience, to enter into a value-based contract in what I'm going to call the former PBM model, primarily because they weren't able to marry medical data with pharmacy claims data. Now, they've gone vertical, and the acquisition of both Aetna and Cigna clearly demonstrate that the PBMs have recognized that's an issue. But I've also experienced the fact that it's more of these very evolved integrated delivery systems like UPMC, maybe Intermountain with Select Health, and others, that they may be more valuable partners to us and actually able to get in conversations as to what I'm going to call sophisticated outcomes could actually look like, that don't just require you to submit claims data. Could you describe for everybody, because you have access to everything, medical data, labs data, why that makes organizations like you a valuable partner for us to actually contract with?
So I think that's the bet that UPMC made when they decided to have this Center for Value-Based Pharmacy Initiatives. I should mention that we work together with Express Scripts, which is our PBM, together on a lot of these projects. And we think because we're able to look at medical records as needed, the doctors, a lot of the physicians work for us. They're part of the team, not all. I think it's 65% that don't, and 35% work within our system. So, but we have lots of subject matter experts at a large institution, and we can try to really focus on things that matter, and then be able to deliver. In terms of patient-reported outcomes, one of and this is an area that we're just starting to develop, to push out, but we really think that it's knowing what the patient's experience is, and all this is just really important. And so Many of you are probably familiar with the PROMISE measures, these patient-reported outcomes. So it's a validated PRO set of questions. And we're rolling these out into our UPMC clinics where when the patients check in, they're given a pad, which while they're waiting to be seen, we ask them to complete this questionnaire. And then that data is, we have access to those data. So we can understand even more how, certain medications, not for everything, but there are certain medications that you can imagine could have a profound impact on patients' quality of life. How do they sleep? I mean, there are a lot of questions in there that look at those outcomes. So we're really excited with PROs. Now, we're just embarking on a couple of contracts where we do this. We're looking at in multiple sclerosis. We're looking at, when we did our survey, we found out that the one thing that turned out to be most important was disability progression. So it wasn't necessarily that they were hospitalized for anything. Oftentimes patients aren't hospitalized, but what they're most concerned about is over time losing function, losing ability to take care of activities of daily living. And so the contract we have there actually requires contacting the patients that are getting these important MS drugs and using a validated disability scale and following them over time. So we think it will be able to demonstrate value in terms of how our patients are doing. We also think that it offers something to our pharma partner in that they're going to get real-world data. They'll have access to real-world data. So everything we do, when you enter into something, you're able to we'd like to think that our outcomes will mirror that of the clinical trials, but until you look for it, you don't quite know. So we think that the fact that we're able to measure these things is important. We met with an industry partner the other day, and we presented data on all kinds of things. We had work outcomes, how many days off patients with this condition called in and missed work, had unplanned illness, and then we had some additional data about our patients, and they said, like, we've never gotten a presentation like this. You all care about what the patients are experiencing and the impact it has on patients. So anyway, that's my plug.
Well, it's a great plug, but now I'm going to translate it into, or get you to translate it actually. So I'm the manufacturer and I come in and let's use the MS examples and the patient-reported outcome. Because how many lawyers do we have out there? Any? Oh, this is really good. So we have to get it by...
They're admitting it.
We have to get it by our legal folks when we're developing these contracts, and typically they want some kind of quantifiable metric in there that is going to allow whatever company they represent or you represent to mitigate whatever risk they might have. And if it's a true risk-based contract, one could argue that both parties should assume risk. But if you could just explain a little bit the mechanics of actually contractually, is it that you measure your patient population and establish a baseline and then determine what the metrics are? How actually does it work?
So it's really different for almost every contract. But I will say that if there's one lesson I've learned is that the lawyers make our lives in this area so much more difficult than I would have ever dreamed possible. So there's been a lot of the issues are, there are some lawyers for companies that will say, if it's not in the label, we can't do it, and we won't do it. That's a pretty big barrier. Interestingly, not all companies interpret that the same way. The lawyers want to make sure that any metric is something that's validated, and I think that's a reasonable thing. There are issues with Medicaid best price that always jump up and create challenges. So typically that's when things slow down, is when we've met with our industry partners, and we've had meetings, we've developed everything, and we have the handshake that we're going to move forward on this, and then it languishes with their lawyers, and then that's not the worst part, then it comes to our lawyers, and it languishes a little bit longer. And some of these contracts are unbelievable. I was just pulled out one because we're starting to look at some outcomes. It was 239 pages long. Now, a lot of it was codes and stuff like that, but a lot of it wasn't. So that is a real challenging part. So that part, and then, it really is hard work. So the reason, that some of these off-the-shelf contracts are attractive is because they've worked out all the kinks. And when we're doing these, contracts that we're working together to develop, we've gone back and looked at the contracts and then tried to figure out, we have to start measuring things. And it has been challenging to go back and look back. I was on a call just this morning because I was looking over the contract. We're starting to gather the information, and I was like, things aren't quite clear to me. I need to make sure that we're in agreement before we start pulling data, to make sure that we're in agreement, so we don't have disagreements later on. So typically, there's interest in knowing what we have, what data we have to begin with. And that's always sort of a dance back and forth, because we don't want to spend too much time doing a lot of advanced data analytics if we're not going to ultimately end up having a contract. So, but it really depends on which contract. Some of the contracts are sort of pre-post with the individual patients. Some of the contracts we're agreeing on a comparator group. It just really depends.
So a lot of us out there report up through executives who have gone to conferences, and the latest, greatest trend is innovative contracting or value-based contracting. And I know if you're like me, about every other day, it's, Jeff, how come we can't do a value-based contract? And it's tough sometimes to explain what the complexities associated with a value-based contract and what goes into it. And one of the things I heard you say was it's time-consuming just to work through the negotiation. But let's talk about the administrative burden, because I've also heard on the reverse side where whoever I'm negotiating the contract with comes back and says, Jeff, what you're asking for administratively to pull all this data and to marry the claims benefits with the medical benefit, et cetera, is just, it's such an administrative burden for such a small patient population. Keep in mind, I'm in rare disease. Can you just offer us a rebate contract? And so I wonder what your thoughts are about that.
So at the end of the day, sometimes a rebate is what makes the most sense for both sides. So yeah, especially when it comes to rare diseases where, think about Zolgensma, for spinal muscular atrophy. It's a $2.1 million drug, and the manufacturer, I think it's Avexis, has a value-based contract. It doesn't make any sense for us who have a handful of kids with SMA that will be candidates for this product to do a lot and try to come up with some value-based contract on our own. Sometimes what we have to, I look at the amount that's on the table, the risk that's on the table, and look at how much data it is that we're going to be gathering, and I wonder whether it is really worth it, and whether we should just say, give us a rebate if we, follow the manufacturer's label and make it available. I've tried to. I've been grateful to the people that I report to, in that I've been trying to make the argument that we're in this for the long haul, and right now, some things may not make sense, but we're gaining experience in this. Everyone's learning together. I don't think risk-based, these value-based contracts, it's not the answer for, how do we control drug prices. It's one of the answers. So I was at a conference somewhere where someone said, everyone wants the magic bullet. Value-based contracts aren't the magic bullet. It's more like a shotgun, You've got a lot of different targets, and for certain things, it might make more sense to do a value-based contract. In other areas, a simple rebate makes more sense on both sides. But I do think, looking at this in the, trying to take the long-range approach, I think it does benefit us as well as our industry partners to figure this out, how we're going to do this. We're learning together, so we're a learning system, and I think our partners are learning. No one knows how to do this perfectly. There are a lot of contracts out there that people are trying to do. I think we're going to stumble along the way, but in the long run, I think as we get smarter about this and as our partners get smarter about this, I think we'll find out easier ways to do some of the data analytics. Some of the companies, we use a third party, and so that just involves us gathering the data and sending it. Some of the stuff we're doing the analysis ourselves. I have a team of people, so we're certainly capable of doing advanced analytics and doing that sort of work, but it's a evolving field, and again, at the end of the day, a rebate is probably the best thing for certain areas, but in other areas, we think the way to go is using a value-based approach.
Before you, when you talked about the third party, is that as a data steward to do the, yeah, okay.
Yeah, we have an agreement. They have a third party that we send the data and they analyze it, and then both parties get to look at it and make sure we're comfortable with what they've come up with.
Yeah, and you mentioned the Avexis contract, and I guess Avexis was purchased by Novartis, and as I understand it, they actually have 22 different NDCs, but they have a flat price because they're weight-based, and it's being administered through Accredo. So I know one of the things a lot of us struggle with is who owns the risk and how do you manage this? Because have you heard of, and I recently heard this on a call. In fact, somebody from Arnold Porter is going to be here tomorrow, but I've heard about this NetFlex subscription model where it's a population-based, value-based contract. Have you heard of what I'm describing, and could you share your thoughts about that with everyone?
So the NetFlex model is appropriate for, it's been used for hepatitis C, is really the case, and maybe it's Kentucky or Louisiana, they subscribe to it. And so the NetFlex model is you go to Gilead or to Merck or whoever it is that has the product that you're going to use to treat that disease, so in this case hepatitis C, and you say, okay, Merck will preferentially use your product for all of our Hep C patients when appropriate. We estimate we have X many 100,000 people with hepatitis C. We'll give you a lump sum payment each year, and we can treat as many patients as we can. And it's up to us it's the same, we get as much of the drug to treat as many of the patients as we can. We have not looked into that at UPMC. Whether we might think about that for certain disease states, I'm not sure. But it's one of the interesting solutions that's being sent out there. It's being floated out there. I mean, there are a lot of problems with these rare diseases that are very expensive. So at UPMC, we have over 100 patients with pretty significant either moderate or severe hemophilia. And so if you think about that disease space, I don't know, we're not far from gene therapy for hemophilia, for both A and B. And if you think about it, I'm sure when ICER does their value-based price, they'll find that it's cost effective. Whatever it is, it's $5 million, it will meet cost effectiveness thresholds, because factor for hemophilia is just so expensive, especially in those patients who have inhibitors. I mean, you can have patients that spend millions of dollars in a year just for their factor. But the problem is that it's cost effective over a lifetime, over a 5-year horizon, time horizon, or 10-year horizon. And that patient may or may not be in your system for all those years. So there are a lot of people talking about this conundrum of how do you, just because it's cost effective, doesn't mean it's cost effective to you if your patients on average are in a commercial plan for 2 years. What happens to them if you pay the upfront money and then your competitor gets to reap that benefit, unless there's some, hate to use the term, quid pro quo, that everyone's doing the same thing. Everyone's covering for the same indications. You can imagine if you are more generous in terms of your coverage and your competitor is less generous, first of all, you're going to get those patients who want to get that access to that innovative treatment. And furthermore, then the patients that come to you probably won't have it, and the patient you send that migrate to them will have gotten it. So it really is it's a complicated thing to figure out, and I think there's a lot of people thinking about this and trying to figure it out.
And I just want to articulate a little bit more on the Netflix subscription model in case you haven't looked at it. I have looked at it, and it works in a larger patient population. If you're in rare disease, it's very, very difficult because it just doesn't work. You give them all this money and you only have one patient. And as Bernie knows, I just launched a drug that has less than 100 infants a year in the US. And they actually present themselves all over the US. So it's difficult. But to that end, and I want to get your thoughts on this. More and more rare disease companies, and I at least with me, my company's based in Sweden. It's a Swedish company, and outside the U.S. capping, where you cap the total spend on a given patient, is very common with different countries. It's not something that we actually can do in the United States, given what we deal with government pricing and reporting. But what some manufacturers are exploring are the ideas of identifying certain centers as centers of excellence. And for certain disease states, those particular centers are the only centers that have access to a given drug or treatment regimen. If you're selected as one of those centers, that's a good thing. But if you're not, that can create challenges. What are your thoughts about that model?
It makes sense that you have these specialized centers. I think with a lot of these advanced treatments, really, if you see only, if you're going to take care of 10 patients with this extremely rare disease, it's much better than someone who might take care of one patient. So, I mean, UPMC does have a number of, is a referral center for a number of these rare diseases. It does bring, it can increase your exposure to paying for this, because then people, if they move there, they can move there and then get your insurance so that they can get that. So it is a good thing. It has some risk. In terms of a Netflix model, the way it might be, and it's not called a Netflix model, but it's where you take a group of rare diseases, and you have to have some way to figure out how you define this so that people don't game the system. But in my opinion, the best way to handle all these, because I saw something recently that by 2030 they expect to have 50 or more, gene therapies out there for these rare diseases. And so, one a disease that affects very few people, in and of itself is probably not going to impact. So if we get one of your patients, it's not going to impact us at all. But if we have 50 of these people, then, of different diseases, it will start to impact us. So, if you have a system where everyone pays in and industry has to, make some concessions too, because then their drug gets covered. Well, then everyone has access to that drug. So everyone pays in a certain per member per month, so that their patients who meet the established criteria for whatever this rare disease is, it comes out of this fund. So it's not quite a NetFlex model, because you're not treating as many people as you can. You're just treating anyone who is a reasonable candidate for it. We have a question.
And before I take your question, if you just saw the dialogue that took place between me and Bernie, these are the kinds of dialogues that we in the industry have to start having, and have to bring the executives from our companies in to meet with folks like Bernie to talk about some of these things and come to agreement on how you can work through the mechanics. So what's your question?
My name is Ryan Rust, and I have a question. I know that Bernie's now said it, and your colleague earlier this morning said it too, that many times manufacturers are coming with contracts and metrics that they're driving but don't really meet your need. I'm just wondering what the alternative would be, and then in an ideal world, with the manufacturer perspective and health plan perspective, what should that engagement look like early on when you're trying to explore what's possible?
From a manufacturer's perspective, I would just say I think we need to go in and be open-minded. We have to change the paradigm. This is not sustainable the way it currently exists. I would encourage everyone to be proactive. The worst negotiation you can enter into is if you are reacting to a difficult situation that has taken place in the marketplace, meaning they have a patient, they don't have reinsurance, or whatever happens, that can create, that doesn't allow for a solution-oriented discussion. And the key here, in my mind, is have solution-oriented discussions with folks like Bernie.
So there's sometimes people come in with a value-based contract that's off the shelf, and we've said thanks, we're not interested. And industry partners said, we're not interested in trying to develop one. And we agreed that we're just not going to go further. And I think if you're a small health plan and maybe you don't have, you don't have people that are able to put the sort of work that we're putting in together. I mean, it's an iterative process. I don't want to make it sound like we're the only ones doing work. It's both sides are doing a lot of work. But if you're a smaller company and you don't insure and you don't have that capability, I think getting experience with some of these value-based contracts, even if it's not the most imaginative contract out there, I think it's great, because I think we all need to get experience, and hopefully with time you will these value-based contracts will mature and will more and more focus on things that are patient-centric, or benefit patients more broadly than simply something like medication adherence, but looking at actual patient outcomes. So I would encourage those folks that might not have the capability to go ahead and enter in, take the ones that are off the shelf if it seems like it would be something that would benefit you. We've taken some of the ones that are off the shelf when it's been not worth our effort to try to. It's mostly in the rare disease space where we can't. It's just we don't have the time to invest in coming up with something on our own.
Thank you.
Thanks.
It's interesting because some of these, if you've been to some of the presentations over the last 2 years at AMCP and some of the other conferences, or some of the contracts that are out there in the public domain are pretty much off-the-shelf contracts that I can't tell you how many A1C contracts I've seen out there for different diabetes drugs. And those are the ones that my leadership is always pointing to and saying, how come we can't get a contract like that? And, you know, maybe it works in that space, maybe it works for certain payers, but a lot of the sophisticated payers, especially folks in delivery systems like yours, actually have the infrastructure in place that we could enter into some pretty unique agreements. What do you think?
I hope that's the case. Yeah. In thinking about some like the A1C, what we've tried to do is say, you know, does A1C matters to some patients? Everyone has patients, and they focus on the A1C. So it's not that it doesn't matter, but if you think about diabetes, the exciting things with the medications in diabetes are, number one, there are some drug classes that improve cardiovascular outcomes. That is amazing, because up until the last couple years, either these drugs were never proven to do anything, or in the case now of sulfonylureas, it looks like outcomes are actually worse in terms of cardiovascular outcomes. So now you have drugs that either are neutral or actually have fewer adverse cardiovascular outcomes. That's amazing. But the other things you look at, there's some that are weight neutral or help patients to lose weight. And I think obesity is such an important, difficult thing for patients with diabetes. Anything that we can do that, so many of our medications make patients gain weight. A lot of the medications outside of diabetes, patients gain weight. So if you have a medication that helps patients to lose weight while controlling their blood sugar, that's a really exciting thing. So we have, one of our more recent contracts we have is built on weight loss, as well as looking at adverse cardiovascular outcomes. And I think we threw in A1C just to, because there was some interest in that too. So.
I have another question.
I do, actually. So you've brought up some really interesting points that I've been kind of following. And one thing that I've been thinking about all day is like total cost of care. And one of the things that we think about measuring in total cost of care can actually be indirect cost to the patients. But that, again, is very tricky for us to, gather the data, collect that and whatnot. It sounds like you guys may have something in place that would be able to do that, but then again, on the manufacturer side, due to patient confidentiality and HIPAA, we wouldn't be able to look at all of that stuff. However, again, that would just go into the risk sharing thing. Is that something that you guys would have the capabilities and net interest of tracking for a patient and factoring into total cost of care as indirect cost as well?
What their copays are. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so interestingly, one of our contracts, actually, when we surveyed one of the things that came back from our clinicians was patients can't get a prescription and then leave it at the pharmacy and don't fill it, mm-hmm. Because of it's a high tiered copay. So in that particular one, we dropped as part of our contract, we dropped the copay to a generic tier. I think that, though, this issue of what does the patient pay out is a really interesting one, and this is isn't associated with any particular value-based contract, but UPMC made a very calculated risk just recently in that we dropped we took all of our diabetes medications, everything, insulins, newer GLP-1s, SGLT, DPP-4s, they're all at a generic copay. So we dropped that from a tier, the brand and tiered copay to basically a generic copay to take away this issue of the financial burden affecting things like compliance. Now, it starts in January 1, 2020. So it's going to cost us a lot of money in terms of we're getting less of our copays. On the flip side, the reason we're taking this, this calculated bet is to say, Patient copays are very, very important for many of our patients, and their access to, very important medications. In the case of diabetes, it's hard to argue against, wanting our patients to be able to take these drugs, and that if they're able to take them, presumably other costs of care will go down. We're going to see how well we do, and maybe I'll lose my job if it doesn't work, but we'll see. But I think it's a really important area that needs to be explored more. Obviously, there's been a lot of talk about this issue of rebates not making it to the patient, that they benefit the PBM or the insurer. In our case, any rebate that we get is what we use to try to keep our premiums as low as possible. But I know that some patient groups still say, well, we're still stuck with paying the higher copay. So we're really looking at this. We're trying to think, diabetes is our experiment. We'll see how that works. We're hoping that it's good for patients. We think it will be, and we hope it'll also be good for the people that buy our plans, because our patients will do better. But we'll see.
That answer your question?
I think
So I'm going to ask you a question, somewhat related, because in a lot of these discussions and value-based contracts, you get into discussions, discounts or rebates. What's the preference when you're negotiating a contract? Upfront discount or rebate?
I would have to defer that to the pharmacy bean counters at my facility. I don't know. My own personal belief is upfront discounts make more sense, but from a financial standpoint of view, I don't know. Probably, for all I know, rebates are equally beneficial. But I would prefer to see just the discount up front and not have to worry about counting, market share and all that kind of stuff.
How about point of sale rebates for the patient? Have you entered into any agreements like that?
No, the way we addressed it was by taking the copay down to a generic copay.
Rob, I think we're running close to time. I think we have time for one more question, if there's one more question.
Hi, Stephanie Arnold with Paratech Pharmaceuticals. Just a quick question around the time horizon from initiation of a value-based contract to the actual implementation. What's your experience, and how long does that normally take?
That's a great question. A couple of them we were able to get done in months, and but none. I think probably 6 months is probably the best we've done. They take time. We have some. The MS one I think probably took us over a year to get that done, and some of you out there are sitting on some contracts and been sitting on them for months. So I mean, some of them take a long time. So yeah, I think we talked about the lawyers, and I think that typically when things slow down, when we've come to the agreement, and then it gets to the for whatever review it is, and then it can languish for months.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, Stephanie, because it can take a lot of time. But also, I've also entered into negotiations prior to approval, which is a very unique way to start negotiating these contracts for a variety of reasons, but part of it is to save time. But the interesting thing about when you do that is typically you haven't settled on your price. So you'll be negotiating all the mechanics of the contract without actually having the price. But these things can, as you well know, can take a long time. So how are we doing on time?
2 minutes.
We got 2 minutes. Any other questions? 3 minutes. Well, listen, we sincerely appreciate your time. Thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of the conference.